My name is Ryan O'Connell, and in this lab I'm going to teach you how to build a traditional Active Directory domain controller lab. Why would you want to build a lab, and then how to actually do this in the portal. So the reason you may want to build a traditional AD lab, you may want to do this so that you can learn the traditional Active Directory services. You'll find this type of setup on premises and in hybrid environments. I've tried to make the lab as close to the real world as possible. You can learn how to create users, groups, OUs, security policies, and more in the traditional environment. And of course, every engineer should know at least how to use Active Directory, or the basics of Active Directory on a domain controller, and how to deploy a domain controller. All you need is an Azure subscription. If you do not have one, create one. It's free. In our lab, we're going to create two domain controllers, traditional domain controllers. We're going to create a VNet, and then we're going to create DC1. We're going to install Active Directory on it, and then we're going to deploy it so that it's client ready. And then we're going to do the same on DC2. We're going to create an additional domain controller. We're going to install Active Directory, and we're going to join it to that forest. The reason I'm creating two domain controllers, because in the real world you will have two domain controllers. The reason why a lot of on-prem services have two domain controllers, 4 or 6, could even be more than that, because if a domain controller goes down, at least all your users can connect to the other domain controller and start using their resources. If you only had one domain controller and that went bump, then you're up the creek without a paddle, because you've lost everything. So it's always good practice to have dual domain controllers in a traditional environment. So what we're going to do in Azure, we're going to go ahead and create a live lab. And the cool thing with this is we're going to use the DNS settings of our server of Active Directory. We're not going to use the Azure DNS settings, because if we do that, we won't be able to connect to our other domain controllers. So I'm trying to, like I say, part on knowledge here so that you guys have the information and the tools to do this correctly. And the way I do it in Azure is how you would also do it in the real world. So if you had to traditionally go and set up a server and install Active Directory on it on-prem, you would know how to do this. But the cool thing with this lab is at least you can go and you can create this lab, you can shut these VMs down, you can keep that lab there. So if you want to create something like a VPN network, you want to set up AD Connect and just learn how to do stuff. You want to maybe learn how to create users and policies. You maybe want to go ahead and create OUs and groups and learn a bit more about security of the traditional around the traditional Active Directory domain controller. So in our lab, what we're going to do is we're going to use a traditional Active Directory domain controller. We're going to install a Windows 2019 server. We're going to install Active Directory on it, and we're going to deploy it. And we're going to duplicate that so that we have dual domain controllers working in sync. And then what we're going to do is we're going to create a test user, say test user 1 on DC1 or DC2. And then we're going to actually connect to the different domain controls and see if our users have replicated over. And again, the reason you'd want to have dual domain controllers is because if one domain controller goes down, the other domain controller can still carry on serving resources to your users and to the rest of the network without bringing your whole organization down to a grinding halt. So this lab is a little bit long, but I hope you guys are patient and you work through it. I had fun creating it, so we look forward to you doing this lab, and I look forward to your feedback. Also, if you want to learn more about Microsoft Active Directory, I would suggest go to the Microsoft Active Directory link here, and this will give you a better overview of the Active Directory domain services, and you can get your head around Active Directory a lot more in depth. Again, I've designed this lab to get you up and running really quickly. I mean, within a space of 30 minutes, 35 minutes, you can have your lab ready, and once your lab is there, you can use it to your heart's content. You can create resources, delete resources, and really get to grips with using the traditional Active Directory. And the cool thing is, it's not messing with the Azure Active Directory. We're not telling Azure to take control. We are telling the server to use the Active Directory and DNS settings from the server itself, which is nice. So it keeps it isolated, keeps it separate, and you can actually have fun working within that lab. So that being said, let's scoot over to the portal and let's get this lab done. As you can see, I've gone ahead and logged into the portal. So the next thing we want to do is create a resource group. So as you can see, I've navigated to resource group. I'm going to click create. I'm going to paste in my resource group because I have stuff written out in Notepad. I'm going to leave it in the default East US region. I'm going to click review and click create. This is going to go away and create that resource group for us. So the next thing we want to do is create a virtual network for our Active Directory domain controllers. So I'm going to go to virtual networks. I'm going to click create here or create virtual network. Either way would work. Make sure you select that resource group, and I'm going to give this virtual network a name. I'm going to call it on-prem network. I'm going to go to the IP addressing. I'm going to accept the 10/16 IP address, but we're going to go and change the subnet slightly. So I'm going to click on default. I'm going to just go ahead and change that subnet. Click save, and then I'm going to go down and go to security. And we want to make sure that all of this is disabled. We don't need it enabled. If you have it enabled, it just means you need to pay some extra costs. And because this is a lab, we're not too stressed. I'm going to go next. We're not going to worry about tags, review, and then this is going to go away and validate stuff. And I'm going to click the create button. And this is going to go ahead and create that virtual network. And that virtual network is going to simulate our on-prem network. So that shouldn't take too long to create. So once that's created, we can go ahead and create our first Windows server. So we'll just close this down. As you can see, it was very quick. So the next thing I want to do is go to virtual machines. I want to click add a virtual machine. And then I'm going to go ahead and put that virtual machine in the AD lab group. I'm going to give it a name. I'll just call it DC01 for our first domain controller. And we also want to create an availability set. So I'm going to go ahead and click availability set and click new. And I'm going to call this let's do it nicely, I'll call it AD Aval set. We'll leave it as the defaults for now, and we'll click OK. I'm going to scroll down and I'm going to select my server. I'm going to use a 2019 server. You could use a 2016 server. I find a 2019 server B2MS, 2 CPUs, 8 gigs of memory is more than enough. So I'm going to go ahead and actually create a username and password for this server. So I've got it all typed out in Notepad in case you're wondering where I'm getting this from. So I'm just going to paste in my password. I'm just going to paste it in there, and I'm just going to paste that bad boy in there. And then we're going to go down to disks. And what I want to do is we don't need high disks here, so I'm going to change this to standard. And of course, we're going to go and attach a disk. And this is where we're going to put our Active Directory services on. This is where it will store. So obviously, we don't need such a big disk like that. So I'm going to click change. And I'm going to change this to standard. And I'm just going to type in there, we only need 10 gig, which is more than enough. And I'm going to click OK. And that's going to create our server, give us that little disk where we're going to put install Active Directory on. I'm going to go next to networking. Obviously, I'm just going to leave everything as defaults. I know in a real world you would want to lock down RDP, but this is just a lab to get you up and running so that you can actually install Active Directory and simulate a real production environment. And you can actually do so many cool things. You may have future exercises or labs that you want to create using a domain controller. And this is the way you would do it. And you would also do this in the real world. So we're going to try and make the real world as real as possible in this lab. I'm going to click on management. I'm going to disable boot diagnostics because we don't need that. And of course, we're going to leave everything as default. And I'm going to go down and go next. And I'm going to go next. We're not going to worry about tagging. I'm going to go next. And then this is going to go away and validate that virtual machine for us. And what we're going to do is once that virtual machine has been validated, we're going to click create. And this will go away and create that server for us. And this is the server that we're going to install Active Directory on. And then we'll create another server. So we'll have two servers. We'll have DCO1 and DCO2. And this is, and we'll have them talking to each other so that we can actually see how things are done. But like I said, it's a really cool lab, and I hope you have fun learning it. So let's just wait while this server deploys. It shouldn't take too long at all. It's pretty quick. And as you can see, it didn't take too long to deploy. So we're going to go to Resource. And then, of course, we can see we've got our server up and running. And also, we want to take note of our IP address. So the next thing we want to do is we want to connect to that server. So I'm going to go ahead and download the RDP client. And I'm going to go ahead and connect. I'm just going to drag this over so you can see. Just going to drag this over. I'm going to click connect. That's going to open up in a window here. I'm just going to type in my username. And then type in my password. And click OK. And then I'm going to go ahead and connect. And I've got dual screens, that's why I'm dragging things across. So once I've connected to that server, I'll drag that server across so you can actually see it. And you can see I'm logging in there. And of course, we just want to click yes, and you can see Server Manager's firing up. And once Server Manager's fired up, we can go ahead and install Active Directory. So we'll just wait for Server Manager to open up. The server is a little bit slow because we're using those standard disks, but that's absolutely fine. So I'm going to go ahead and close that down and just let it finish doing its thing. Now that Server Manager's done its thing, what we want to do is we want to go down to Tools, we want to go to Computer Management, and we want to add that disk that we created, because that's where we want to install Active Directory to it. So we're going to go down to Disk Management, and we're going to leave it as an MBR, a Master Boot Record disk. We're going to click OK, and we're going to initialize that disk, and we're just going to do a quick format. And we're going to go Next, Next, and we'll leave it as F, and we'll create a simple volume, and click Finish. And this will go away and create that simple volume for us. So the next thing we want to do now is we want to go ahead and install Active Directory. So I'm going to go ahead and close this down and come to Manage and add roles and features. We want to go Next, and I actually want to choose role-based. So we go Next. Obviously we go Next again, and then we select Active Directory Domain Services. It's going to go ahead and install a whole lot of other tools for us. So we're going to add those features. I'm going to go ahead and go Next, and I'm going to go ahead and go Next, and obviously we get some information about Azure Active Directory and a whole lot of other bits and pieces. So we go ahead and just say Next, and I'm going to click Restart the server. You know, I like to do that. Sometimes the server does require a restart, sometimes it doesn't. And I'm going to go ahead and click Install. Now this is not installing Active Directory. This is just prepping the server for the Active Directory installation by adding those features. Once this role wizard has run, we will then go and promote this server to a DC or a domain controller. So we'll just wait a little bit while this goes away and deploys itself and gets all these features set up. So we'll just give it a second while that runs. It can take anywhere from about a minute, maybe to 2 minutes, depending on your server and depending on your network and depending on your Azure environment. So we'll just wait for this to complete. It shouldn't take too long. And as you can see, that didn't take too long. So we want to go ahead and promote this to a domain controller. So I'm going to go ahead and click promote this to a domain controller. And what we want to do is we want to say New Forest. And we want to go ahead and type in your domain name. This can be anything that you want. It could be Microsoft.com. Before, in the past, Microsoft used to say that you need to actually have your local domain like myazureguru.local. That's no longer the case anymore. So again, you can just type in your domain name and you can get up and running. So I'm going to go ahead and say make sure that you say add a new forest, because we're not adding an existing domain. We'll do this a bit later, and we're not going to add a domain controller to an existing forest. Again, we'll cover this a bit later on, so we want to go ahead and go next. And this is going to go away, and it's going to do some checks. Obviously, you can see the forest functional level is 2016, and you've got all these other lower levels, but you want to keep it at 2016. That is the latest one. You want to go ahead and type in a password that you can remember. And the reason you put a password in here is because if you ever want to uninstall Active Directory, it's going to ask you for this password to uninstall Active Directory. So I'm just going to go ahead and paste this password in because I have it in Notepad and I like to keep things simple. So I'm just going to go ahead and paste that password in there and just paste it in there and click next. Now this is going to tell us, it's going to go ahead and tell us we need to create some DNS delegations and stuff. I mean, that's absolutely right, because we haven't got DNS set up yet. It's still got to install, and we'll go ahead and add this a bit later on. So I'm going to go ahead and go next, and obviously it's going to go away and give us our NetBIOS name. And remember, if the NetBIOS name is too long, it will truncate it and shorten it out for you. And it's always good to try and keep it what the Active Directory installation does, because if you start changing things here, you can get a little bit confused. So I'm going to go ahead and click next, and this is now going to prepare the server to install Active Directory. Now we want to change the C drive to our F drive. Remember, we did our F drive with that disk that we created, and the reason we created that disk is because we want to actually keep our cache, because if we put it on C and something happens and we lose our cache, we will also lose our Active Directory settings. So I'm just going to type this in quickly, and I'm sorry, into the S, and I'm just going to change this again to F, and again it's going to install our Active Directory on our F drive. So I'm going to go ahead and go next, and this is going to give us validate some stuff for us. I'm going to go ahead and say next, and now we're actually installing Active Directory, and the server will require a reboot. And again, this can take a couple of minutes to install, so we'll just wait while it installs. Also, as you can see, you're going to get some warnings here about DNS and other bits and pieces, so we're not too stressed about this at the moment, because once we get up and running, we'll fix all of these DNS errors that we're getting. Also, nothing you want to be aware, take note of, you want to make sure that this is this green checkbox says that you passed the prereqs successfully before you begin. Otherwise, you'll run into strife if you don't. So I'm going to click install, and now it's going to go away and install Active Directory, and it's going to give us a whole lot of warnings. But again, this is standard with all servers, so nothing to stress out about. We just go ahead and install it. Again, we'll fix the DNS issues once the server has been installed. So we'll kind of wait a little bit while it goes ahead and installs Active Directory for us. And then we'll go ahead and we'll change the DNS, because we don't want the Azure DNS in our Active Directory, because otherwise our second domain controller won't be able to talk to each other. So we actually want to use the DNS of the server itself. So again, we'll go ahead and set that up a little bit later on through this lab, but we just want to get our Active Directory domain controller up and running. So I'll just wait a little bit while this runs. It shouldn't take too long to run. And as you can see, it's successfully installed that. The server's doing a restart. So we'll just wait for the server to do a restart, and then we'll actually log back into that server. So as you can see, there it goes. It's restarting. So what we want to do now is we want to do the same thing with our DC2. So I'm going to go ahead and create another virtual machine. We're going to click add, I'm going to add another virtual machine, and I'm going to put it in the same resource group 2, and I'm going to call this DCO2. And of course, I'm going to come down to the availability sets. I'm going to select that, and I'm going to select my availability set that we created earlier on. I'm going to go ahead and give my server an admin name and a password. Again, I have this out in Notepad so that it's a lot easier to and a lot quicker for me to get through this lab, because this lab is a little bit long, but I think it's worth the effort and worth the grind if you guys hang in there while we complete this lab. Again, I'm going to go next for disks. I'm going to change the disk to standard. I'm going to go and attach that disk. Remember, we want to create a disk for Active Directory, so I'm going to change that size. I'm going to change the disk to standard HDD. We're going to give it a 10 gig disk, and I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And I'm going to go ahead to the networking, make sure we're in the same on-prem network. I'm going to leave everything as the defaults. I'm going to go next for management. Obviously, I'm going to turn off boot diagnostics. You don't want boot diagnostics turned on because it's a lab. Normally, you would use this if you're having boot errors or boot problems that you need to troubleshoot. Then you would have boot diagnostics turned on. But in our case, because it's a lab, we're not too stressed about that. We're going to leave everything else off. And I'm going to go next. I'm not going to worry about tagging. And I'm going to go ahead and click review and create. This is going to go away and validate our settings for DCO2, and while it validates those settings, we should get a green check here saying that it's all successful. Now we can go ahead and click create, and what this is going to do now, it's going to go and deploy that second server, and we're going to use that second server as our domain controller. So we'll kind of just wait a little bit while this server goes ahead and deploys and gets itself up and running. So I'm going to go ahead and RDP to DC1. As you can see there, we've got DC1 and there's our domain name. I'm going to click yes, and I'm going to remote into that server. So we'll just give it a second while I RDP into it, and then I'll just drag the screen over because it's opened up on a second monitor on my desktop. So I'm just going to pull this across, and this can take a little bit of time to do for the very first time because it's deploying your group policy, it's deploying a whole lot of other features. And this can take a couple of minutes. I would say at least 3 to 4 minutes to deploy. So we'll let that deploy. Like I say, it shouldn't take long at all. It might even be quicker. Again, it all depends on your environment. So we'll wait for that server to fire up, and then we'll actually carry on. And as you can see, it's finished doing that. It's going ahead and it's logging me into our server. So while that's doing that, what we actually want to do is I'm just going to drag this to my other screen for now, and we actually want to move over back into our virtual machines, and we want to go to DCO1, and we want to take a note of the IP address. And as you can see, the IP address is 10.0.1.4, so I'm just going to copy that. Also, what you would want to do is once you've got your IP address, if we go into networking and we go to our network adapter, a good thing to do obviously in the real world is you would go ahead and actually go to IP configurations, and then you would select your IP adapter, and then you would go and assign it a static IP. Obviously, because it's dynamic, it'll change and you won't be able to connect to it. So you would assign a static IP, and you just click save, and that would save it as a static IP address. The next thing we want to do is we want to move over to our virtual network, and in our virtual network, that's where we want to go and change it to the Active Directory DNS. So we can click on-prem, and of course we can go down to DNS servers, and if you notice, by default it's saying Azure provided. So we want to use a custom DNS because we want to use the DNS of our server. So I'm going to click custom, and I'm going to paste my DNS server's private IP address in there, and I'm going to go ahead and click save, and that's going to save that DNS address in there so that we use Active Directory for our DNS, not Azure. So again, that can take a little bit of a while to deploy. So let's drag my machine over here, and again we can see we're in DCO1, and if we go down to tools and we go down to Active Directory users and computers, we should see now there's our domain controller, and it's been successfully deployed. And of course we come down into our users and we can see everything is there as if you were working on your domain controller on-prem. So you can see there's my username. So this server is pretty much ready to go. So I'm going to close this down because we don't need to be in there. And I'm just going to close this window down because we don't need to be in that window at the moment. Again, I'm just going to minimize this, and we're going to go back into our virtual machines, and I'm going to move over to DC2. And once we're in DC2, I'm going to restart it so that it gets its DNS from our Active Directory, not from Azure. So I'm going to go ahead and click Restart, and that's going to restart our server DC2. So we'll just wait while that restarts. It shouldn't take too long. It's pretty quick. And let's go have a look here, and we can see it's successfully restarted. So let's dismiss all those notifications because we don't need them. And I'm going to go ahead and click Connect, and I'm going to download that RDP client, and then we can connect to our server. I'm just going to type in my password. We can get rid of that, sorry. I'm just going to drag it over again, my credentials, and we'll just log in. And it's opened up on another window here. I'm going to click yes, and as soon as it's opened up on this screen, I'll just drag it over. It shouldn't take too long to open up, and there we go. I'm just going to pull it over, and we're going to do basically the same thing again and install Active Directory. We'll just let Server Manager fire up and do its thing, and then we'll go ahead and install Active Directory. So I'm going to go ahead now. Again, we want to go to Tools. We want to select Computer Management. We'll wait for Computer Management to fire up. Once Computer Management has fired up, we want to go ahead and select that disk that we provisioned, because that's where, again, we want to install Active Directory. We want to leave it as an MBR disk. I'm going to click OK to initialize that disk. And of course, we're going to go ahead and do a simple volume format of that disk. So, and obviously we're going to leave it at F and click Finish, and that will go ahead and format that simple volume disk. So what I want to do now is actually want to close this down, and we want to go ahead and go to Manage, Add Roles, and of course we want to now go ahead and install Active Directory on this server. So I'm going to go ahead and say next, next, next. We want to install Active Directory domain services. We're going to accept the features, click add, and we're going to go next, next, and next. And then of course we're going to say do a restart if you need to, and we're going to go ahead and install those services. So we'll just hang 5 while it installs those services. It shouldn't take too long to do that. And as you can see, it's gone ahead and it's actually completed. So let's go ahead and promote this domain controller. Now what we want to do, it says add domain controller to an existing domain. We've got add domain controller to a new domain controller to an existing forest, and of course add a new forest. So obviously what we want to do is we want to add an existing domain controller, add a domain controller to an existing domain. So I'm going to go ahead and paste my domain name in there. And obviously we're going to change this because we need to have the credentials for our domain controller. So I'm going to go ahead and click change. And I'm going to go ahead and just quickly modify this a little bit. And I'll put in my server admin name, which was and I'm going to go ahead and type in my password. and click OK. This is going to add my VS admin there. I'm going to go ahead and click next, and this is going to go away and it's going to talk to our domain. And by default, you know, we've got our first site, so obviously we're going to go ahead and type in that password. Now I'm going to go ahead and go next. I'm going to go ahead and go next. And the domain controller, as you can see, I'm going to say let's replicate from DC01. I'm going to go next. And obviously here we want to change this now to that F drive that we created. And using that disk, again, the reason we created that F drive is because if our server crashes, at least we can retain our Active Directory information and it's not lost. So I'm going to go F, and I'm going to go ahead and go next, next, and this is going to go away and it's going to validate, and we're going to go ahead and install Active Directory on this server. Obviously we're going to get a bunch of DNS warnings here for this server, but again, not too stressed out about it. This is standard with all servers that I've installed from my experience. So we'll just move on, and while this goes ahead and deploys. So again, this can take a couple of minutes to deploy, so we'll wait for the deployment to complete. And as you can see, it didn't take too long, so we'll just wait while the server signs us out and reboots. It shouldn't take long at all because it's going to do that, so we'll just give it a minute while it does that. So I'm going to go ahead and connect to that server again using my RDP client that I've downloaded, and we'll just give it a second because it's firing up on another window here. So I'll just drag this over here so that you can see this server firing up. And again, it's going to go ahead and install the group policy, and it's going to do other bits and pieces, and it's going to take a minute or two while that goes ahead and completes. So we'll just wait for that to complete, and then we'll carry on with the lab. And as you can see, it's gone ahead and it's completed. So what we'll do is we'll just close this down so that we don't get prompted to use this. So I'm just going to close that down for now. And if we go into our tools, we can see we've got Active Directory users and computers. So let's click on Active Directory users and computers, and we'll just wait for this Active Directory users and computers to fire up. And as you can see, we're on the domain, and if we go to computers, you can now see in our computers, we should see our domain controllers, and there's our two domain controllers, DC1 and DC2. So I'm just going to close that out for now. I'm just going to minimize this, and I just want to we want to actually now go back into our server, and as you can see, we want to go to get an overview, and we want to grab our IP address, which is this IP address here. So I'm just going to copy and paste that. Then I'm going to go over to my virtual networks, and then I'm going to go to my on-prem network, and then obviously I'm going to move over into my DNS servers, and I'm going to go and I'm going to add that other server as a DNS server and click save, so that we've got two servers up and running. Again, I want to scoot back over into our virtual machine, and I'll go back to DC2, and under DC2 I'll go to networking. I'm going to go to that IP address, and then what we're going to do is we want to go to IP configurations. I want to select that IPv4, and I want to assign it a static address. Again, like we did exactly with DC01, because obviously if your domain controller's IP addresses change, then you're going to have issues connecting. But we're not quite done yet. We still want to go ahead and do some bits and pieces as well, so we'll just wait for that to deploy. It'll take a couple of seconds to do. So what I want to do now is I'm going to go back onto my domain controller, my DC01, and I'm going to connect to that, because we're not quite finished yet. We actually want to go and fix some of those Active Directory sites and services. There's a few things that we need to clean up in order to get our system running nice and smoothly. So again, I'm going to go into Server Manager to make it easier for you guys. So we'll just give it a second while it goes and finds Server Manager for us. We'll click on Server Manager, and of course we will come down to Active Directory Sites and Services. I'll open up Active Directory Sites and Services, and as you can see, we've got our sites and services here. So I want to go and change the name. So I'm going to go and say rename this, and I'll call this, say, on-prem. So we can say that's our on-prem network, because you can use this lab to create a VPN connection. You can use it for a whole lot of other cool things. So it's nice to have the flexibility to do some training. So we're not quite finished. We need to go and add a subnet, and we want to go ahead and add that subnet from our Azure. So what we're going to do is I'm going to just drag that over, and I'm going to go back to virtual networks. I'm going to my on-prem network, and of course on my on-prem network I'm going to go to subnets, and as you can see I'm going to copy this subnet address here. I'm going to click Control-C to copy it, and then I'm going to just move back over here, and to subnets I'm going to go ahead and create a new subnet, and I'm going to go ahead and paste that subnet in, and I'm going to associate that subnet with this on-prem network. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK, and there we go. We've now created our subnet, and we've associated. This is how you would do it in the real world. So let's go and have a look and see if we can actually connect. So I'm going to go back into Tools. I'm going to click on Active Directory Users and Computers. So obviously I can come down here and I could say change domain controller. So I'm going to go ahead and change the domain controller to whatever DC you want it to use. So we could go ahead and now create our user. So I can go ahead and create a user. So I'll call this user new, let's say new user. And let's create a new user, and let's call this user test user 1, and we'll just type in here test user 1. We'll go next, and obviously we'll give that user a password. And click OK and click finish. So I'm going to go back into DC02. So I'm just going to drag that over here for you so that we can see we're now in DC02. So I'm going to go ahead again into DC02. We can go back down to Active Directory Users and Computers, and we can see we've got DC02 there. Again, we can go, scroll back up here, and of course we could change the domain controller. And we can say, right, I want to select DC01 and click OK. And we could actually work on DC01. And we can see that we've got our user that we created, test user 1. Now let's see if test user 1 is actually replicated to our DC02. So again, if we said change domain controller, and I selected DC02 and said OK, and scrolled down to users, we should now see our test user, and there it is. There's our test user 1. So we've successfully deployed a dual domain controller in Azure, and we are using the domain controllers Active Directory and DNS to do all of our work. We're actually not using the Azure DNS. So I know this lab's been a bit of a long lab. I hope you guys have learned some things. Again, this lab is designed to get you up and running with Active Directory, show you how to correctly deploy a domain controller into Azure so that you don't have any issues or any strife as you move through your training. And the nice thing about this is you can use this lab for any other resource that you may want to test. You may want to create users, you may want to test group policies, you may want to create a site-to-site VPN, you may want to create a site-to-work VPN, whatever the case may be. It's really useful. You can use this lab in a lot of scenarios to get you up and running and to get you comfortable if you need to learn how to work with server and how to work with Active Directory. Again, you can go one step further, and we could actually install AD Connect on this server and then connect it to our Azure Active Directory. But again, that's for another lab, because this lab has taken a bit of time. So again, I would like to thank you for viewing. I'd like to thank you for subscribing to my channel, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Be awesome, Azure Gurus.